Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I probably say this almost on every podcast, but today is going to be unique because our guest, who I'm going to introduce in a minute, actually knows the person who we're going to be talking about. And that's kind of unique. Usually we have people talking secondhand. So I want to thank, first of all, David Schoen for being our guest today. I know how busy you are and how busy you have been, but you have a unique sense of knowledge of what's going on. So I thought it would be appropriate to do it before the election results. Anyway, tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Well, I'm a lawyer. I've been a lawyer a long time. My practice based in Montgomery, Alabama, and Atlanta, Georgia, and New York City. I do only litigation, but mostly constitutional litigation, civil rights work, and criminal defense work. I do mostly cases for sort of everyday people, but I suppose the reason you're having me on is because I was lead counsel for President Donald Trump in his second impeachment trial.
So you've had an opportunity to talk with him privately. I'm not going to ask you what you talked about, but
Sure.
you've
He's
gotten to know him.
he's been a great friend to me and very, very gracious every time I speak to him.
I think we want to get that to the public too, because many people have a different perception of him,
Yeah.
and people have already told me that when you talk to him privately, he's a good guy with a good sense of humor and all the rest of it, which is certainly different than he's portrayed, especially by the left. Anyway, the claims are being made right now. I think it's probably going back to the time of the reelection that we're heading toward a dictatorship and that Trump is going to be a dictator and that we should worry about our democracy. Uh, what do you think?
I think it's a phony claim, has no basis in fact. The Constitution, as you well know, Judge, provides for a robust power for the executive, and President Trump has been exercising that robust power in the interest of the country, I would suggest. Um, he's jumping into a number of wars around the world. He recently helped secure the hostages in what looked like an intractable dispute between terrorist group Hamas and our ally Israel. He's now making his best efforts in the Ukraine and Russia. He certainly operates by executive order at times, but so have the most recent presidents, including Biden and Obama. But I think he's a man of action, and he sees a lot wrong in the country that needs to be righted, specifically from the previous administration. And he's intent on doing what he believes he had a mandate to do based on the election.
Well, some of the things he's doing, he's correcting things that he was left with by the previous administrations. And if you look at some of the results, it justifies the conclusion that he's doing a pretty good job on some things. I don't necessarily agree with him on some things, but immigration has really changed positively, notwithstanding the allegations of brutality. Uh, Not only that, but he's also dealt with, as you said, the situation in Israel, and that's from Thomas Mathis. And that so there's been a real progress made on just about everything. Anyway, so constitutionally, we have been observing the use of what's called executive orders. And what happens is the public hears this term all the time, but they never really have a definition of what it really means. It sounds like one thing, and the bottom line is it really is not that. So why don't you explain to the folks what exactly is an executive order?
Sure. Well, the executive order is the most direct way for the president to exercise the executive power that the Constitution gives to him, Article 2. Um, it's always subject, and this is one of the many reasons I say not a dictator by any means. It's always subject to challenge, to judicial review as to whether it exceeded the executive power and infringed on, let's say, the legislative power or not. But there are certain areas in which the line is not clear at all, and the executive certainly has power. If it crosses that line, then a challenge is made to the court, and the court decides. For example, I mean, one obvious example is the allocation of troops in a certain situation. We know that a declaration of war has one constitutional concept, but something short of that, an emergency situation requiring the use of troops, might be appropriate for executive order or um, issues that arise sort of every day. He's issued many executive orders on voting issues, on immigration, and various issues that also are in areas that Congress legislates in. But as long as they don't contravene a piece of legislation or infringe on Congress's power, then pursuant to the robust executive power that he has, he can issue an executive order and it has the force of law.
Well, since you're such an astute lawyer and academician, you think he's violated any of the rules regarding executive orders?
I don't think so. But again, as you know, Judge, they're being challenged now in court, many of them, including the use of troops. Here, there's a question of whether he, if he decides to do it, improperly invokes the Insurrection Act, which would allow him to federalize troops to go into a city, for example, in these cases, if there's a finding that he makes that there's an insurrection, as that's defined. That hasn't been the case yet. That may not be subject to judicial review. And that's one advantage to him, I suppose, of that. But that's also particularly objectionable to a number of people for that reason. But the executive orders now being challenged have to do with the areas of voting rights. Are the voting rights issues that he's addressed in executive orders solely within the province of the states, for example? That's one issue that's going to arise. I would suggest they're not. We have federal legislation in the voting rights area that puts requirements on states. The UACAVA ballot system for overseas veterans, for example, requires the states to take certain steps by certain dates and so on. And so we know that everything is not left to the states. Voter ID now is, one of those pressing issues. But the sending in troops to the cities, National Guard into the cities, is one of the hot issues now. And there are other actions that are being taken, not short of executive order, that are being challenged also. The appointment of interim U.S. attorneys by the Attorney General. It's another executive power that, some of the courts so far have struck down on procedural issues. That is, whether a certain period of time has passed so that it reverts to a judge's decision to pick the interim U.S. attorney, or does the president retain that power to do successive interim appointments? It's all very, very interesting, it seems to me, from a constitutional perspective, on where we draw the lines in determining the powers among the three branches. But it's vitally important to our system, as you know and have a vested interest in, Judge, that we have the judiciary to decide these disputes.
The question then becomes whether or not the president will adhere to any judicial findings.
Yeah.
People are saying he's going to ignore it. Whatever the courts do, he's just going to ignore it and take it over. That certainly sounds pretty much like a dictatorship.
That would be, but that's other people speaking, in my view. I mean, he speaks freely about how he feels about court's decisions, but he has said repeatedly that he will never violate a United States Supreme Court decision. As you know, we're seeing in sort of unprecedented fashion his team applying for immediate review to the United States Supreme Court and getting opinions that may not be dispositive of the case in the future, but because they involve injunctive relief or some other kind of immediate action, the court has stepped in and in many cases corrected the lower courts on that, the executive power to fire certain members of so-called independent agencies within the executive branch and issues like that. I don't buy into this idea that the court by any means is a rubber stamp for him. I don't think so at all. And anyone who suggests that some of these justices, even those considered to be on the right, would do anything that President Trump wants done, in my view, are absolutely wrong.
Well, it sounds like one of the issues, the big issues, is states' rights versus the federal government. And that distinguishes, to some degree, the difference between the Democrats and the Republicans. If you look at the Democrats' proposal, the progressives, they just want to give away money. And that's contrary to the Republican side, or the right side, I would say, where they're more fiscally responsible and certainly more conservative. And that's what you're going to see on the Supreme Court. the division between the three liberals, purportedly referred to as liberals, and the balance of the court. Certain justices are predictable, and you know where they're going with any of this, but there are some very weighty issues. In fact, I was thinking the other day, I can't remember all the years I was practicing and on the bench that there were so many constitutional issues at one time. Maybe because we're promoting them differently than we did in the past, but it just seems like we have so many things going on at the moment that are really definitive as to the direction in which the country is ultimately going to be.
Yeah.
So, like
That
one
may,
of the
yeah,
one of
that
the
may,
questions deals with police power.
sure.
And we know that's a constitutional issue, but just for the sake of information, what exactly is the war police power?
Police power is a variety of things in which the government, could be a state government or the federal government, has the right to act. It specifically is related to law enforcement actions most directly, but it covers a whole panoply of state action, which I think sort of defies any precise definition. Um, but anyway, it's coercive action, you might say, by the state, that affects individual rights. And the question is whether the state exceeds its power, and by state I mean either a state government or the federal government exceeds its power, or the individual rights trump it, no pun intended, so that it would be an excessive use of the so-called police power. It's interesting. You've posited as states' rights. Sometimes we see the traditional equation in that area reversed now, with generally it's one, conservative position that uh, in favor of states' rights. Here we have a Republican position of very robust federal government powers. So, the exercise of the Border Patrol and immigration policies would be a part of the police powers here. Yeah, it's very interesting. You mentioned also maybe unprecedented number of big issues at the Supreme Court. That could well be true. I mean, I know in wartime, we've had many pressing issues. Beginning of the last century, many pressing First Amendment type issues that really carved out a whole body of law. But you're right. I mean, the president has said now that he views this tariffs decision that's to be argued tomorrow as one of the most important constitutional issues ever to come. I mean, he has based his view of the economy to a great deal on this tariff policy, what he considers to be finding a balance in tariffs. That is, getting even with evening up the tariff equation with countries who have placed tariffs on us in the past.
Well, I asked the question about the police power because of what's going on with the ICE
Right.
enforcement of the immigration law. And can you tell us what the difference is between both positions? Not
Meaning,
not being able to regulate or inform the ICE people what to do versus
ah,
some of the
oh
alternative.
yes, these are the
No,
pressing issues in Chicago now and Portland, and maybe we're going to see in New York City soon, and all of that. So, depending on the situation, the president has the right to, and then again, this is subject, now court opinions that are making new law in a sense, but that I think may be reversed eventually. President has the right, on the one hand, depending on the authority under which he activates the troops, he has the right to potentially federalize state National Guard troops or our mainstream military and send them into the cities. But that's primarily if it were to reach the stage of the so-called Insurrection Act, not so-called, it's a federal statute, the Insurrection Act.
yeah,
On
I was
the
going to
other
ask you
hand,
about that.
pardon?
I was going to ask you about that because one of the problems that we as the public have is we hear these terms all the time. We're really not sure what the definition is. And I suppose, depending on what you're watching or listening to, is the view that you ultimately accept. But the insurrection clause has now been bandied around for a while. Can you tell us what that exactly is?
It really is intended to mean a risk of the overthrowing of the government, the advocacy and then action in furtherance of that advocacy that risks the overthrowing of the government. Could be a city government, could be state government in these cases. And so he's taken the position, at times at least, that the lawlessness that we're seeing in the cities, Portland, Chicago, the murder rate and so on, is bordering on that. But he hasn't exercised it yet. But he is saying that he has the right as president to send in National Guard, which is generally, under the authority of the governor of that state, that he has the right to mobilize those troops to help in the city. So now the question is that help restricted to help effectuate or facilitate the role of ICE, who are federal agents operating in the city? Or do they really have broader police powers to really take over, in a sense, the police force in the cities? And generally, the cities have been prevailing on the latter question. But I think pretty uniformly now, the courts have decided and will be deciding that the president has the right to have the military come in and help facilitate ISIS, the actions of federal agents operating within the city. Then the question becomes, how far can he go? Can the military troops help ICE, make arrests, capture fugitives, and that sort of thing, or not? And this is all being tested now in the waters, but we'll see how it plays out.
What do you think is going to happen? Just an opinion.
Yeah, I think that ultimately, um, if it goes so far as to invoking the Insurrection Act, he has an argument that it's not subject to judicial review. Um, I don't think it'll go that far. I think that they're going to find a balance, and the courts will certainly recognize that he has the right to help ICE. He has the right to have a broad authority with respect to ICE policy, that is border control. Border control clearly is within his ambit, and he throws around these figures now of somewhere between 10 and 25 million people illegally in the country. And so he believes he has the power to not only regulate that, but conduct deportations. The courts have shown some antipathy to that, and the public has shown some antipathy toward raiding factories and that sort of thing, where people are working productively, rather than the initial idea of getting off the streets illegal immigrants who have committed crimes or are suspected of crimes even. Um, I think in that case, in terms of deportation process for those who have committed crimes, I think that's going to go forward full speed ahead. I think any court will approve that. There's a very interesting area playing out now that I'm interested in because of a number of lawsuits I have, and that is the deportation of terrorists or those who advocate or advise or support terrorism. And in my view, some of these folks on some of the university campuses, particularly in my view, Mahmoud Khalil and others like him, are subject to deportation under federal statute 8-1182, which there are two statutes that go in tandem. One is that people who advocate for, members of terrorist organizations advocate for, support, advise, provide material support for, etc., terrorist groups or terrorist agendas can't be admitted to the country. And then there's a second statute that copies that and says anyone who violates that section is deportable. That's the section that I think ought to be invoked now. And for example, with Khalil and others, we have a number of materials we've acquired in these lawsuits that shows direct support for Hamas and other terrorist organizations, which I think really makes them immediately subject to deportation. So far, you've seen courts coming down and others contending that there are First Amendment issues at stake and that they're really just advertising for a people or speaking out against military action and that sort of thing. Their materials that I have, at least, go way beyond that. And I'm interested to see how those actions play out.
Well, one of the interesting things is that it kind of intersects with the next issue I want to talk about, which is free speech. You're familiar with Brandenburg and the cases
Sure.
that have come down regarding the right to say whatever it is versus inciting people to do things that are either illegal or in some way offend customs and practices. And the bottom line is, right now, there's a big push over what gets aired. I'm using the word aired because I don't know the technical terms for it, posted or whatever it is. It's shown to people because we see what's going on with the violence and the guns and the efforts to basically radicalize a bunch of people. And exactly that's what's happened. So the argument is you shouldn't let them do that. the counter argument is it's censorship. You have the First Amendment right to say whatever you want. And that is a very big issue right now, especially because of the amount of money that's involved for these providers and the changes, potential changes in the Communications Act, which provides basically an immunity for these people to do pretty much whatever they want to do. And we know the reason for that is it's called lobbying. A better, less nice word is corruption, because that's exactly what's going on with all these things. And you talk about cleaning up the swamp. Maybe you cleaned up the old swamp, but this is a new swamp with new alligators. But the bottom line is that at some point there's such vested interests in expanding the ability to do whatever they do because they get making money on the advertisements. That's going to be a real big issue. How do you think that's going to play out in front of the Supreme Court? Because that's the balance issue.
Yeah, that's a very vitally important issue. I mean, you're talking to someone here I'm just about an absolutist on the First Amendment. So that's part of what, in my view, has made this country great and separates this country from every other country in the world. We protect hateful speech. Speech is anathema to most normal civilized people, with the belief that the marketplace of ideas will weed out those kinds of speech, and that civilized people will know that it's out there. And it's important to know, in my view, it's important to know that there are Klansmen and white supremacists and hateful people on the left and on the right out there, rather than having them hidden under the rocks from which they came. And to dismiss those arguments that they make. One of the big cases of the Supreme Court was the Westboro Baptist Church case, which these lunatics go around to military funerals and protest against the families and say horrible things. But that's part of our system. And I want to know that those things are out there so we can dismiss them. The issue you raise is a very specific issue that's vitally important. I think most people really aren't, aware of, and that is the immunity afforded to Twitter or X, whatever they're called now, and other social media platforms under Section 230 that has shielded them from liability. And the Twitter case was a very important case, came before the Supreme Court last year. We have to see where the lines are going to be drawn. Is it appropriate for them to just post anything that someone puts on the site and have no responsibility for the consequences? Or do you draw a line at violent conduct, violent advocacy, and stripping their immunity when those kinds of things are permitted? We saw it abused, their immunity abused in the last administration when unpopular, at least to the left, viewpoints were banned from Twitter and Facebook, other platforms. That can be a dangerous proposition. It's true. I don't like turning on social media and seeing hateful things, anti-Semitic things, racist things, and all that. But again, it's important for me to know that there's a population out there that believes those things, so we know how to counter it and protect against it. So, I would draw the balance in favor of free speech. That doesn't mean giving blanket immunity, though, for the consequences for a social media platform that publishes that free speech. I don't think I would give that blanket immunity. But
it's a
the question
liability.
arises, again, in these terrorist cases, if they give a platform to Hamas or one of these groups that's advocating, trying to garner support and all that, does that violate the material support statute, which makes it a crime to provide material support to a terrorist organization? Or should they be liable at all because they're merely a conduit for the information? It's a question.
It's going to be a liability issue more than anything else, because in terms of the tort of negligence and other torts involved, the fact is that this is going to come up all the time. The other night, I actually watched the interview with Tucker Carlson. I'm not a big fan, but Tucker Carlson interviewed a guy by the name of Nick Fuentes, who's a notorious anti-Semite, violent anti-Semite. In fact, he said, when we take over, we're going to kill all the Jews. And he came out and said that. So the question is whether that language is protected or it's not protected. What do you think? I know that you're an absolutist on the First Amendment, but there may be some exceptions to that or some variations.
Well, Right. You mentioned Brandenburg. I mean, if there can be shown a clear and present danger, an incitement to violence, in this case, killing and all that, then it's certainly not protected, and it shouldn't be. But I want to know about a guy like this, Nick Fuentes. This guy is really crazy. I mean, he's mentioned my name in his posts. I saw one not long ago that he wrote. Somebody sent it to me. That how suspicious it seems that a Jew like me was representing Jeffrey Epstein and Donald Trump, and therefore there must be something to concealing the records and all of that. Everything in his life seems to center around anti-Semitism, but Tucker Carlson has just gone off the deep end. He's absolutely out of his mind now, in my view, at least. I would like to know about his sources of funding that's driving this. He also had a guy on there named Daryl Cooper, so-called historian, who he said may be the most important historian in the world these days. This is a guy who said that Hitler really didn't want war. It was Churchill's fault and the Jews' fault, and so on. And these are just wacko theories to go out there that demean the heroism of our country and the soldiers who fought for our country and turn history on its head. So for a guy like Tucker Carlson, who has a wide following, to put those kinds of things out there, or a Candace Owens, who's an absolute moron, has no idea what she's talking about, but nevertheless doesn't let that stand in the way of her bigotry. It's reckless what he's doing, but I do think he's permitted to do it. And people talk about the cancel culture. I don't think he should be banned from doing it, but I think everyone should, isolate him and speak out against him, and ultimately get him off the airwaves.
But
But
these
that not
companies like,
because the government does it, just because he's not popular.
well, the companies, Twitter and the rest of them, have banned people. In fact, President Trump was banned for a
Sure.
period of time. And isn't that really kind of distinguished from the argument of free speech?
Absolutely. I mean, they banned any talk that made suggestions. Some of the platforms banned talk that challenged the theory on COVID or challenged traditional thinking about vaccines. It's not a matter of what one believes. I mean, I've taken all of the COVID vaccines and all of that, but I think if I don't agree with the point of view being put out there about vaccines, but I'm also not medically trained. I'd like to hear all of what everyone has to say who has anything significant to contribute to the debate about that and other issues of public concern. And so I don't believe in this banning, even banning talk of election fraud and all of that. Election integrity, must win out over the other. We can't do that. We can't do it based on political, excuse me, political considerations and that sort of thing. And I don't think those decisions can be divorced from political agendas and political decisions.
Well, it's interesting. I interviewed as a guest on our show Robert F. Kennedy, and obviously his opinions, his views are disputed by many. But it does come down to a very interesting question, which I'm not sure has been decided yet. You would know, and that deals with the question of mandate. Can the government tell you got to wear a mask versus the right to say no? And
Yeah.
we're seeing that
Well,
with the vaccines, but we're seeing it with other things as well. And then you get into the question of police powers and regulation,
exactly.
general welfare under the preambles of the Constitution. So you see all these basic conflicts in definition and understandings of what these terms really mean. So, what do you think about the mandate situation? Just personal opinion as a constitutional lawyer.
Yeah, no, you're exactly right. It really implicates the police power in the most pure sense. Can people be forced on penalty of whatever, fine, imprisonment, some other punishment, um, on a matter that's a health issue? I think at the end of the day, the answer is yes. That if there's a finding by the government that there's a again clear and present danger, to borrow from another source, of public health on public health issues and that sort of thing. We may not now, in retrospect, or even then, have agreed with a mask mandate, but I think that ultimately the courts would come down in favor of that, where there's a so-called finding, with a finding of a so-called public health crisis involved. There, I think the police powers are given extraordinary weight.
Well, what's interesting is the election is being held today. And if people are stupid enough to vote for Mondami, and many people will, and to me, it's absolutely amazing that anybody could vote for this socialist who's said some horrible things about horrible subject matters, but that's what we're going to be seeing pretty soon if he gets elected. We'll know tonight. But the reality is, we're going to see conflict for sure. New York is going to become a real hotbed. I was talking to my son yesterday who lives in New York. People are talking about moving out.
Sure.
And I just wanted to ask you a question. I know you're not a real estate lawyer, but I know one of his proposals, which of course he's never going to be able to do, is to provide free rent or the equivalent of some kind of rent control on the landlords in the five boroughs. Do you think that could pass muster constitutionally,
Well,
forcing the
there
landlords?
has been, as you know, traditionally rent control and rent stabilization in New York, and it has been upheld in the past. But this free rent business now, and to the extent he's really hitting the pocketbooks of the landlords, I don't think the courts are going to uphold it. But I think you're 100% right that people are going to be moving out of New York. This guy, in my view, is absolutely reckless, not to mention completely unqualified for the position, says outrageous things. I believe he's a bigot. I believe that if and when he's elected, he will change the face of New York City forever. As recent articles have said, the fact that he's even in the running consideration, let alone the front runner, means that New York is lost already, in a sense, to the traditional place that is held in prominence in our country. There's speaking about real estate, there's a notice that goes around on the internet now: prices for homes in Florida. Get in on it quick.
Oh yes,
Pre-Mondani pricing available today. That sort of thing. I think you're going to see big exodus from the city. He talks about raising the city income tax rate. That's unbelievably high as it is. I don't know how anybody affords to work and live in the city. But you think about the idea historically: Mayor LaGuardia, Mayor Lindsay, Mayor Bloomberg, fill in the blanks, and now this Mamdani. It's unbelievable.
well, what about the free buses? Everybody should go ride
Yeah,
for free. You know what the public doesn't understand, and it's never really been promoted, is guess who's going to be sitting next to you on the bus? Somebody who's homeless, who's going to
yeah,
use it as a hotel because
sure.
in the summertime they're going to use it because it's air conditioned, and in the wintertime they're going to use it because it's heated. So you think you're going to have a free ride? Maybe you will, maybe you won't. I'm not sure he could get it through anyway, but the reality is that's who's going to be sitting next to you on the bus, and they'll be bringing their bags with them and all this stuff because that's going to be home. But what do you think about that idea of free buses? Think you can get away with that?
I don't think so. Listen, everybody would love to have free buses. We already saw a tremendous downfall in the city when de Blasio was in office. I mean, anybody who's familiar with New York City over the past 50 years saw it as a very changed place when he was in. Eric Adams, actually, in my view at least, improved the city a great deal. But in terms of crime, look, you can. I personally believe in the legalization of marijuana, certainly personal use marijuana. But there's not a street in the city you can walk down now that doesn't reek of marijuana, trash on the streets, that sort of thing. It's only going to get worse under Mamdani. But I don't think the main issue with the free buses is, you're going to see New York in a deficit like never before. I remember when I was younger, when New York faced near bankruptcy. Um, but I think you'll see something much worse now.
And you think that there'll be some free speeches as well?
Sure, because in my view, again, now the left has been the worst on censorship that we've ever seen. These folks, AOC and Bernie Sanders and their crew, absolutely try to censor speech left and right if it doesn't agree with them. They think they have all of the answers. You saw this Linda Sarsour now, who's a huge bigot, anti-Semite, and so on, has said she's going to be outside Mamdani's door each day, making sure he adheres to the DSA policies and that sort of thing, stays true to who he claims he is. By the way, his father is even worse than he is. Apparently, his father has written some horrific things about Jews and others. Yeah, it's really inconceivable. I wish, from my perspective at least, I wish Curtis Slua had pulled out. I think it might have made a difference. We'll see how it's going to, nobody knows how it's
I'm
going to
not
turn
so
out.
sure.
But
About that. The
yeah,
argument is that if he pulled out, what would happen is people would just sit home as opposed to changing their votes to
that's true.
Cuomo's.
And a lot of the recent stuff that's come out about Mamdani. I don't know why it only came out recently. Came out after early voting started already. So there were a tremendous number of votes cast in the early balloting. I think people have made up their minds. Nobody all of a sudden is going to decide, in my view at least, nobody's all of a sudden going to decide, gee, I think this Mamdani's better than I thought. What I'll never understand is this rabbis from Mamdani, Jews from Mamdani. He's a Jew hater. And from everything that I've seen and read, Mark Levin on the radio compiled a list of number of outrageous statements that he's made. They're just beyond the pale, and especially historic videos of this guy, unless you believe a leopard changes his spots.
Overnight.
Yeah,
I wonder if the election has anything to do with any of that.
right.
Saying that rhetorically. Anyway, I want to touch on one additional item, and that's the potential for war. You mentioned it earlier. It just looks like, we're ready to invade Venezuela and other places. And we've seen an involvement certainly in Iran and around the world. And while I agree with what he's doing personally, the reality is people are questioning whether he has the authority to get us into quote war end quote versus some other procedure that allows him to do what he looks like he's going to do. What do you think about that?
Look, I believed 100% in the Iran thing, and if it's necessary, we should do it again. I don't think he's going to go into with troops to Venezuela. The world recognizes now that when he says something, he generally means it, and he's a man of action. I don't think Venezuela really wants to risk that, and I don't think he wants to put American troops on the ground in Venezuela. There might be strategic strikes, but I don't think so. Yeah, you're right. I mean, it's very important to have war power remain with Congress and so on, formal declarations of war. It's also important for the executive to have the flexibility to respond to war areas around the world, especially those that put Americans at risk. I think, he's talking now about saving the massacre of Christians in Africa. Those kinds of things, traditionally have been what many people on the left cheered as part of the American spirit. That is standing up for people being oppressed. But, there's a limit to how much we can do with our troops and still maintain readiness for any kind of major, God forbid, war that could arise.
Well, it's kind of interesting that Dick Cheney passed away today.
Yeah.
You want to talk about being the policeman for the world. And there's a guy that was probably at the forefront of most of it.
Yeah.
But the reality is that the War Powers Act, that's why I wanted to start our conversation, and we'll close after this, is the use of the War Powers provision versus having to get approval of Congress. And you know where the progressives are going to be with any of this.
Sure.
And where do you think this is going to go?
I think that he's going to push the envelope on that balance as far as it can go, probably. But I do think in today's world, with military assets as they are, with every Tom, Dick, and Harry having intercontinental ballistic missiles and advanced technological warfare, I think that the executive branch is going to have to maintain that power and flexibility and authority to be able to commit something that's short of war, but it's a military action. And we're always going to have to maintain that authority in the executive, even if we see a president like this, who, in my view, responsibly activates and uses that authority.
Well, we certainly have done things that we haven't done before.
Yep.
And it seems to be a good academic explanation for all of it. And you certainly have helped to move that forward. The reality is a lot of these issues are so close calls, difficult to predict the outcome of anything, especially when you're dealing with the judicial system. So
right.
I wanted to again thank you, David. You're
Thank
a
you.
pleasure. I love having you on my show.
It's always a terrific discussion with you. You're so on top of the issues. You have such a background in it. It's really a great honor and pleasure to talk to you about these things.
Well, thank you. And we try very hard to inform the public. Part of it is information, part of it are guidelines, and part of it are explanatory. So you really answered a lot of questions today that are on people's minds that had no clue. They hear what they hear, they see what they see, but coming from you, it makes a big difference. So
Thank you very
thanks
much.
again, and we'll see you again.
Great. Look forward to it.